So this is my senior collection from SAIC's fashion program. The collection is called 612 Million Years, and it's based on a 612 million year long span in evolutionary history on Earth, starting from the Ediacaran period going through the Paleogene period. So here you can see a timeline of the Phanerozoic eon, which includes everything from the Cambrian to the Paleogene. And so the reason I chose this topic is because I'm very passionate about the sciences, and I like the idea of using visual art as sort of a mode of storytelling to introduce both fashion people to this whole world of science and ecology that I'm so passionate about, and also try to introduce those people to a completely different world of fashion. So I actually ended up filming a collection video at the Field Museum and got footage of each one of my looks in the relevant exhibits related to evolutionary history. So I'll just show that and you can see each of the looks and their kind of habitat. So the place that you'd kind of start with in talking about the complex life on Earth would be the Ediacaran period, as far as when you get to the truly complex life. The first known life was cyanobacteria, which you can see here. It built these interesting structures called stromatolites, and that existed for much longer. But in the Ediacaran period, there was the start of these things called rangiomorphs, which you can see here, that had this interesting frond-like structure. They're still pretty unknown as far as their actual ecology, where they would fit in terms of classification, but they sit somewhere sort of preceding animal life as we know it. So when I was translating the Ediacaran period into a look, I wanted to kind of capture this inhuman element because these life forms obviously feel so much further removed from us. So I wanted to kind of distort the human anatomy, cover a lot of the body. I wanted it to feel like there was an indication of what was to come, but that it was still pretty far removed. So the end of the Ediacaran period led into the start of the Cambrian period, which was the start of both the next eon and the first era within that. And so the Cambrian period was defined by this event of like the Cambrian explosion, which was a time when bilateral symmetry took off and there was a mass diversification of animal life. This was often attributed to changes in the composition of the seafloor with greater oxygen levels, and all of this led to just a greater variety of life, different niches and food chains, general predation dynamics, a lot of things we take for granted today as far as animal life and how animal life expresses so much biodiversity. And there's way more types of animals that arose during this time than I could possibly get into. But in this just sample, you can see some of the important ones, which include Pikaia, which is the first known chordate, meaning it had the first nerve cord, which is very important as far as the development of vertebrates. And then you can also see radiodonts, which were some of the prevalent predators of the time. So when I was translating the Cambrian period into a garment, I wanted it to feel kind of like visually overwhelming and capture that element of like rapid evolution and a sense of like overgrowth. And so I wanted it to be kind of disorienting to look at. I ended up doing something with the silhouette where it's hard to see in some of these pictures, but that the shoulders are meant to resemble these like hexagonal compound eyes, and then on the front it has these two kind of claw pieces coming off of the waist. So from the front, it kind of resembles like the face of the radiodonts. So following the Cambrian period was the Ordovician period, which included a lot of cephalopods, also these things known as crinoids or sea lilies, some of the first known fish that were jawless. And so this was both building on the existing creatures of the Cambrian period, at least those that did not go extinct from like the minor extinction at the end of the Cambrian period, but was generally just kind of building of reef ecosystems and building on the Cambrian life. So this piece is a bag for the Cambrian look based on the Ordovician period, and I grouped them together based off of mass extinction. So because the mass extinction followed the Ordovician period, and there was only like a minor extinction in between the Cambrian and the Ordovician, I chose to kind of connect the two. And so this piece is based off of the nautiloids of the Ordovician period, along with some of the other jawless fish, trilobites, just other life of the time. So following the Ordovician period and the mass extinction was the Silurian period, which included a lot of different creatures, but most notably some of the first boned fish, and then also the first vascular land plants. And so these are two very important elements of this time period, and also just the development of the jawed fish. So this piece is based on the Silurian period and is an accessory for the following look that you will see later. And this features a Eurypterid, which is also called like a sea scorpion, which you can see at the top. And then there also is a type of fish at the bottom that had this kind of armored face. And then also Cooksonia, which is the first vascular land plant. So the Silurian period led into the Devonian period, which is known largely as the Age of Fishes, but is also defined by the fish to tetrapod transition. So that is the transition from fish to four-limbed beings, and specifically, in this case, also the first terrestrial tetrapods. So you can see there was a transition from Eusthenopteron and a lot of these fish into various forms of amphibians, and then eventually into this first terrestrial amphibian. So this is the look based on the Devonian period, which goes with the Silurian period accessory. But for this one, I wanted to capture this kind of transition to land in a kind of comical way. At first I thought about like, how can I make it beautiful? But then I realized the transition to land is kind of inherently awkward, and you saw some of those creatures, they had kind of a silly in-between. And so I wanted to kind of distort the body, have the head and upper half be this tree, and kind of like land plants and swampy feeling, and then have this head coming out of the torso and these fin gloves. So I really wanted to kind of play with costume, and I think this one definitely is kind of the silliest I go with just having fun with the concept. So the Devonian period led into the Carboniferous period following another mass extinction. And in the Carboniferous period, there was an increase in oxygen levels, which coincided with growing rainforests and led to these very large insects. And then also the development of the cleotic egg, which is this stronger type of egg that allowed for eggs to exist on land and be better protected. It also marked the origin and split of the sauropsids and the synapsids, which will make more sense later. But synapsids include everything kind of leading up to or close to mammals. And then sauropsids include reptiles and everything that falls under reptiles, even if it's not kind of colloquially thought of as a reptile. And so synapsids and sauropsids start off looking very similar with only slight differences in terms of their skulls. And so a lot of these differences don't really show up until later on, where you can visually distinguish pretty well. So the piece based on the Carboniferous period goes with the following look that you will see, and it is meant to resemble this cleotic egg, and then also Meganeura, which is this very large dragonfly. And so I wanted to create just like a fun egg bag. So the Carboniferous period led into the Permian period, which was dominated by proto-mammals, which were synapsids. And so these synapsids dominated the land, and then the sauropsids of this time largely were herbivores and largely were prey to these synapsids. And so these things that you see here, most of them, the synapsids, resemble dinosaurs or reptiles superficially to a lot of people. However, they are more closely related to mammals and sort of leading up to mammals instead. And so the reptiles occupied a much different niche, seemingly almost kind of like cow-like. So they were these kind of big grazing herbivores that were preyed on by these groups of synapsids. So the Permian period ended in an event known as the Great Dying, which is the largest known mass extinction, in which virtually all, like the vast majority of animal life on Earth was wiped out. And this seems to be due to climate change and just sort of an environmental collapse. So this is my look based on the Permian period. I wanted to create this really wrinkly, textured thing, and also have kind of a gloomy, ominous aesthetic with the Great Dying idea. But I was trying to figure out a way to create like an interesting look using these creatures that overall had like relatively simple anatomy. And I ended up realizing this kind of skin was like the most interesting element to me. So I did a lot of fabric manipulation to create this really stretchy garment that was made of a ton of fabric but would just like sit right against the body. So the Great Dying led into a new era, the Mesozoic era, which started with the Triassic period, which was dominated by these creatures known as archosaurs, which roughly translates to ruling reptiles. And so these ruling reptiles include various things like crocodilians, dinosaurs, non-dinosaur, dinosauromorphs, just a lot of various types of reptiles. And something worth noting is the things we think of as reptiles, usually diapsid reptiles, split off from these archosaurs much earlier on. And so archosaurs actually includes crocodiles and birds as their sort of living representation. But there was a much wider range, of course, at the time. And I think it's interesting because we think of diapsid reptiles, so things like lizards, and then we think of crocodiles and sort of proximity to them, when in reality, like crocodiles and birds are much more representative of kind of like a singular grouping. So this is my look based on the Triassic period. This was when I was wanting to start to get into more humanoid ideas because these are the more recent and more familiar periods. So I thought being more like referential of like typical clothing and having it feel more humanoid was like fitting. And so with the idea of like the archosaurs as ruling reptiles, I wanted to create something that felt very regal and had this like kind of crown-like headpiece. And then I also was just thinking about like capes and kind of unused sleeves that hang over the shoulders, and just finding ways, yeah, to translate both kind of elements of like regalness in human clothing with this very threatening and like aggressive anatomy and ecology of these probably very scary animals. So the Jurassic period that came next was kind of dominated by dinosaurs and had a diversification and branching of dinosaurs into theropods, which include a lot of the carnivorous dinosaurs, the things that seem more bird or raptor like, which includes Archaeopteryx and Anchiornis, which are some of like the earliest known flying or at least gliding dinosaurs. And then you have things like Stegosaurus, which are ornithischian dinosaurs, which are also known as like bird-hipped dinosaurs, even though they are more distant from birds. And so these largely were more herbivorous, and so you have dinosaurs kind of branching into a much wider range. So this is my look based on the Jurassic period. I created this big moving wing that was connected to the arm. It had like a hinge, a bunch of like hardware on the inside. Definitely would have made it differently with knowledge that I have now, because it was very heavy and just like hard to maneuver. But this look is sort of meant to feel just like kind of like a rugged explorer, which I think is how it feels with this kind of jungly environment of the Jurassic period and these sort of creatures developing flight and kind of agility. So, following the Jurassic period was the Cretaceous period, which is known for this mass extinction that's pretty famous of like the KPG mass extinction, which is when the asteroid impacted with the Earth and created the Chicxulub crater. And so this is still a pretty contentious thing. Like, not a ton is known about the exact intricacies of everything that happened, but in the Cretaceous period leading up to that, there was like a significant specialization of the dinosaurs that kind of diversified during the Jurassic. You see things like ceratopsians, you see Ankylosaurus, Pachycephalosaurus. You see like a lot of various specialized anatomy geared towards very specific ways of life. And then there was also the first known flowering plants. So for the Cretaceous look, I kind of wanted it to feel like angelic, but also apocalyptic. And so I created this arm piece of like the asteroid, and then kind of built a crater in like the hip of the garment. And then I made this scarf and this headpiece with this cloud motif. And then the leg is based on Pterodaustro, which is a type of pterosaur, which occupied a like kind of similar niche to like a flamingo or like a pelican sort of. So in the background throughout the preceding periods, mammal life kind of further developed but remained mostly dormant. And so after the mass extinction of the Cretaceous period, the Paleogene period, which was the start of the new era, the Cenozoic era, the mammal life went under adaptive radiation and basically diversified to fill all of these open niches because so much of the large life got wiped out. So you see mammals returning to the water with things like Indohyus, Pakicetus, and just generally this transition into whales. And then you also see things like the first carnivorans, so things that basically led into like caniforms and feliforms and like the kind of vaguely dog cat like things that we have today. And then also like things like equid evolution with the first horses and kind of the development of like a hoof. So this was like a very interesting time as far as kind of the resilience of animal life on Earth and how all of these niches remained existing in spite of the extinction. They just had to be filled by further evolution. So this is my look based on the Paleogene period, which features this arm piece based on Myocetus, which is one of the kind of pre-whale creatures. And then I created this like bustier thing based on Arsinoitherium, which looks kind of like a rhinoceros, even though it's not directly related, but it had these like two horns coming out of its face. So that's everything. Thank you for listening to me talk through the details of my collection, show you my work, and I will finish off with the runway footage from the SAAC fashion show.